was in prison, he helped others by interpreting their dreams. And so that was something very special that he was able to do. That was with God's help, of course. God gave him the message to give to these people, to interpret their dreams, to give them the idea of what was going to happen next in their lives. And it did. And two of them got the interpretation of their dreams. One of them was executed as Joseph predicted he would be. The other one was supposed to go back to Pharaoh and remind Pharaoh that Joseph was in prison and unfairly and really should have been released. And maybe you've been in a situation like that sometime in your life where you weren't really being treated fairly. Maybe things just weren't going very well, and you thought that something needed to change, and you saw a solution. And you figured, well, if this was what would take place, this would solve my problem. And somehow, for whatever reason, it didn't take place. And that's what happened to Joseph. The man was supposed to go back and talk to Pharaoh. He didn't do that. And so Joseph ended up in prison for 2 more years. When you've waited for something, maybe you've waited for something for a day or a week or a month or even several months. Joseph was in prison for 2 years waiting for some kind of relief from this, waiting for the answer that should have come right away. And that was very difficult for him. When we are in difficulties, we need to trust in the Lord. We need to turn to him. We need to stay close to him. We need to trust him for it and realize that God is still sovereign. And God, in his good timing, will bring about the results that God has planned. Joseph was real good at doing that. Joseph went through an awful lot, and yet he didn't see the results very quickly. Well, eventually, Pharaoh has some dreams, and the man who was supposed to get him released says, oops, I just remember. There's a guy in prison who can interpret dreams. And so they brought him in to Pharaoh, cleaned him up, redressed him, got him all shaved and everything as he needed to be to appear before the Egyptians. And so Joseph came into Pharaoh and was able to interpret Pharaoh's dreams, not by his own strength or his own ability, but because God gave him that message. And he was willing to be who he was supposed to be in God's sight, in God's plan. And so the message came through to Pharaoh. So Joseph interpreted the dreams of Pharaoh, and the dreams were that basically there would be 7 years of plenty, good and plenty, and there would be 7 years of famine. Now, those were difficult dreams to interpret. The people that normally helped Pharaoh understand things like that couldn't come up with an answer, but Joseph did because he was God's man and he was bringing God's message to the situation. And so Joseph brings this message. 7 years of plenty followed by 7 years of famine. Well, 7 years of plenty, that's easy to understand because Egypt was doing well. They had the Nile River to provide for them, and so everything would be fine. But the 7 years of famine were a little bit more difficult to believe. And so Joseph was able to give wise advice to Pharaoh about what to do about all this. And that's what we find in Genesis 41. I'll begin in verse 29. Genesis 41, beginning in verse 29. Indeed, 7 years of great plenty will come throughout all the land of Egypt, but after them 7 years of famine will arise, and all the plenty will be forgotten in the land of Egypt, and the famine will deplete the land. So the plenty will not be known in the land because of the famine following, for it will be very severe. Well, maybe you've had a situation like that where things got so bad for you, you could hardly remember the good days. And we need to realize that sometimes that's what takes place, and that's what it was for the people in Egypt. Verse 32, the dream was repeated to Pharaoh twice because the thing is established by God, and God will shortly bring it to pass. So this is God's plan. God is doing it. God is sovereign. God is over all. There's one God, not a lot of gods like the Egyptians believed in, but Joseph knows the one true God, and he brings that to their attention. And so he gives advice. In chapter 41, verse 33, we have finding the solution. And Joseph is able to do that. In verse 33, now therefore let Pharaoh select a discerning and wise man and set him over the land of Egypt. Let Pharaoh do this, and let him appoint officers over the land to collect 1/5 of the produce of the land of Egypt in the 7 plentiful years, and let them gather all the food of those good years that are coming and store up grain under the authority of Pharaoh, and let them keep food in the cities. Then that food shall be as a reserve for the land of the 7 years of famine, which shall be in the land of Egypt, that the land may not perish during the famine. So here Joseph is giving advice to set someone in charge of the situation. Now we could ask, well, is Joseph thinking of himself? I don't think he really was, but he's giving God's plan, giving the message that God has given him. And basically it says, store up the grain when you have the chance. That's a wise plan. During the time when it's easy, when it'd be easy to take things for granted, that's the time to act. That's the time to store up the grain. And that requires some maturity. It would be very easy just to live high and not think about the future and figure, well, that famine will never come. He was wrong. But what they do is they store up the grain and they do things right. It takes some maturity, it takes some commitment to keep doing this for those 7 years. And it takes some faith that God's word is true. And Joseph knew that God's word was true, and he was able to convince Pharaoh that these things were going to take place. Another thing is the famine is survivable. It is not the end. And many times we get into a circumstance and we think that this will never end, that there will never be a solution, that my life is ruined or whatever it might be. But God's plan still goes on for the life of Joseph and in many cases in our lives as well. So the famine is survivable. And also, God's plan is always able to overcome all the obstacles. Whatever the obstacles may be, God's plan is bigger. Whatever the problems are, God has solutions. And we need to trust him and walk with him and go to him with our problems and know that the answers lie with him. Well, so favor comes to Joseph, and the advice is good. And verse 37, the advice was good in the eyes of Pharaoh and in the eyes of all his servants. And Pharaoh said to his servants, can we find such a one as this, a man in whom is the Spirit of God? I want you to notice that he doesn't say the spirit of many gods or some gods or our gods, but that he seems to understand that there is a true God, and he will recognize that this is good advice. He could have ignored it. He could have said, Joseph, you don't know what you're talking about. He's been told what will happen for the next 14 years, and so he is wise enough to believe it and act on it. And Joseph is the man of the hour because he is bringing God's message to Pharaoh. And Joseph has been prepared for this day. He was in the home of Potiphar. Potiphar was a high official in Egypt, and Joseph was in his household for a number of years, and he was able to rise to the top there. And so he was prepared for the audience that he has with Pharaoh. And so he is going to be lifted up. He's going to go from rags to riches, from the prison to the throne room. And we see that Joseph so often becomes the man of the hour, not because Joseph is so great, but because he's faithfully walking with the Lord. And that's what we need to do as well. Joseph rises to the top. I would bring to you a few suggestions on that. He was the favored son. He was running Potiphar's house for a time. When he was thrown into prison, he ended up running the prison. And now he has become the number 2 man in Egypt. He is like a prime minister of Egypt under Pharaoh. And what a marvelous position to be in. And so Pharaoh says, there's no one like you. Verse 39, Pharaoh said to Joseph, inasmuch as God has shown you all this, there's no one as discerning and wise as you. Verse 40, you shall be over my house, and all my people shall be ruled according to your word. Only in regard to the throne will I be greater than you. So Joseph really has arrived. You may recall Joseph had some dreams a long time ago about being in charge, about people bowing down to him. And those dreams were looking like they would never be fulfilled, was when he was in prison and suffering all those things. But now here it is. God's plan is going to start being fulfilled as he can see it. And so he says, you'll be over all my house. Verse 41, Pharaoh said to Joseph, see, I have set you over all the land of Egypt. Then Pharaoh took his signet ring off his hand and put it on Joseph's hand, and he clothed him in garments of fine linen and put a gold chain around his neck. The signet ring is like a blank check. It's like handing Joseph his checkbook and saying, you run the country. You know what you're doing, and you will do what's right. Now, why does Pharaoh trust Joseph so much? Why does he look at him and see that this is the guy he should trust? Well, obviously, God is with Joseph, and anybody can see that. Not only does he interpret dreams, but he is a man who serves God, who loves God, who honors God, and he will honor everybody around him. And the sovereign plan of God is in action in Joseph's life, and maybe others can see that. The brothers sold him for a slave. They did evil, but God used that for good. And that is a kind of a running theme in the life of Joseph, that whatever bad takes place, God uses it for good. There are things in our lives that seem bad, that don't seem to be going the right direction, but God is still sovereign, and he can turn those things and use them for his purposes and for good. And why else did Pharaoh trust Joseph so much? Well, Pharaoh was probably, many scholars believe that this Pharaoh was of the Hyksos kings. The Hyksos were not native Egyptians, but they were Bedouins from the Arabian desert. And so Pharaoh may have been some kind of a distant relative of Joseph's family, at least in nationality, closer in nationality to Joseph than to some of the other Egyptians. Those are some of the things that scholars believe. And maybe he hoped that Joseph would be more trustworthy than some of the other people he's dealt with. When you're a ruler, you deal with people who will turn on you. You deal with people who will lie to you, who will not be trustworthy. And maybe he can see in Joseph something that he hasn't seen in the rest. And so he gives Joseph the signet ring like a book full of signed checks. And at this point, then now Joseph can see what God has been planning for him all along. Joseph can see that there's something going on that will be fulfilling God's plan for him. And God has plans for you even when you can't see them. God has plans for Joseph. God has plans for you even when you can't see what those plans are. And we need to walk with the Lord and trust him all along the way. There's a lot of confusion and difficulty in our lives. But in spite of all of that, God's plan is bigger and better and more trustworthy than all the other things that come to us in our daily lives. Well, let's go on. Verse 45, Pharaoh called Joseph's name Zaphnath-Paneah, and he gave him as a wife Asenath, the daughter of Potiphar, priest of On. So Joseph went out over all the land of Egypt. So Joseph gets this name Zaphnath-Paneah, which means God speaks or God reveals secret things. That's the perfect name for Joseph. We will just continue to call him Joseph for obvious reasons. Joseph gets a wife. Now, the wife is the daughter of a priest of On. So she is most likely not a believer when she comes to Joseph. And we could say, well, what's he doing with an unbeliever? But he's been given her by Pharaoh, and she will come to Joseph in the midst of a situation and in the midst of her heathenism and unbelief. And Joseph will have the opportunity to share the truth of the true God with her. She will be in much like the situation that where each of us are when we come to Jesus Christ. Maybe you have a family member that doesn't know the Lord. You need to pray for that person. You need to be a representative of God to that person. You need to show that person what it is like to know the true God and to walk with him. And that doesn't mean beating them over the head with the Bible, but it means showing them with your life and your words, but mostly with your life, because sometimes they don't want to hear your words, but they can see your life. And they can see that there's something special about you, something different about you as you live for the Lord. And so as each of us come to the Lord, we are in a similar situation, and we each need to come to the Lord and show those around us what it means to know him. And we need to go and represent the good and plenty blessings that only God can give. And Joseph is going to do that. So Joseph gets a wife. Verse 46, now Joseph was 30 years old when he stood before Pharaoh, king of Egypt. And Joseph went out from the presence of Pharaoh and went throughout all the land of Egypt. Joseph is now 30 years old. He is, coincidentally, the same age as Jesus when Jesus began his public ministry. We see lots of parallels between Joseph and Jesus. A lot of ways that Joseph suffered, Jesus suffered. Joseph became the answer that they needed. Jesus certainly was. We see a lot of parallels, hated by his brothers and so on. So Joseph now becomes the leader of these people in Egypt at about the same age as Jesus was when he began his public ministry. This is about 13 years after Joseph was sold by his brothers. So he has been in prison for 2 of those years. He was in Potiphar's house for a while, And by elimination and a little math, we can figure out he must have been in Potiphar's house for something like 10 years. So that's a long time. It's a long time that he has been kind of on hold, waiting to see what God is going to do in his life. But he has been faithful. So that brings us to verse 47. And faithfulness in plenty. Verse 47. Now in the 7 plentiful years, the ground brought forth abundantly, just like it always had. But now it's significant because of the dream and the prophecy. Verse 48. So he, that is Joseph, gathered up all the food of the 7 years which were in the land of Egypt, and laid up the food in the cities. He laid up every city the food of the fields which surrounded them. So every city became a headquarters for ease of distribution later. Joseph is smart. If you're a Christian, you don't need to put your brains aside and just act dumb. You can be smart. God can use your abilities for his glory. And Joseph was a smart guy, and he planned this very well. Verse 50, and to Joseph were born 2 sons before the years of famine came, whom Asenath, the daughter of Potiphar, the priest of On, bore to him. Joseph called the name of the firstborn Manasseh, for God has made me forget all my toil in my father's house. So now we see there's going to be a family coming for Joseph. Now, Joseph, I think, probably still remembers and thinks about and wishes for his family back home. Remember, his brothers sold him into slavery, but Joseph loved his family in spite of that. He loved his father Jacob. He loved his little brother Benjamin. And Joseph would like to see the family again. And so even though he is not with them, God blesses him with 2 sons, and the first is named Manasseh. Manasseh means, it has a meaning of forget. And we might say that God helped Joseph to get over the original family homesickness and the suffering in slavery, the suffering in prison, all that Joseph went through. God helped him to get past all of that. And one of the ways is for the birth of 2 sons. And the first one is named Forget, as he is trying to forget some of the things that went before. And verse 52, the name of the second he called Ephraim, for God has caused me to be fruitful in the land of my affliction. So Ephraim means fruitful. So now he has forgetting and fruitful. Or someone has suggested amnesia and ambrosia. So he has 2 sons. They're very different in their names, perhaps different in personality, but God has a plan for them. Now, you might say, well, how important is it that Joseph has 2 sons? And I want to show you how important that is. Eventually, the people of his family are going to move down to Egypt. And from the 12 sons of Jacob are going to come all those people in Egypt who are eventually going to become slaves in Egypt. And eventually, from that slavery, then God will call a man, Moses, to come along and lead them out of Egypt. And from the time they came to Egypt with 12 sons and their families, they grow to a nation of perhaps 2 million people. And so God's promises come to them that they will go to the promised land and take over that land and be fruitful and have a long history in that area. And eventually, Jesus will come from that area and from that family. Now, let's think about that for a moment. You have the 12 sons of Jacob. Joseph is one of those sons. And about 500 years later, they will march into the promised land. They will take over the land. And then you have the 12 sons taking over the tribes, the 12 tribes from the 12 sons taking over the promised land. True or false? False. It's a trick question. Because the Levites, the tribe of Levi, did not get any of the land. Does that sound familiar? If you've studied this before, you know that. They didn't get any land. So now we're down to 11 tribes. And Joseph's family did not get any land. And so now we're down to 10 tribes. Are you confused? Manasseh and Ephraim get to split what would have been Joseph. So now we're back up to 12. Does God know what he's doing? Does God have a plan? Does it all work? Does it all fit together? It fits together in your life just like it did for them. So you have Jacob's 12 sons. Joseph and Levi don't count because the tribe of Levi won't get any of the land. Joseph's tribe won't get any of the land. But Joseph's tribe splits into Ephraim and Manasseh. and now you have the 12 tribes getting the land, the promised land that God already promised for them. So Manasseh and Ephraim will split Jacob's inheritance, and because Levi gets no land, and Joseph by himself, his tribe by itself gets no land. But it all goes exactly the way God planned it originally. And God knows what he's doing. Do you think God knows what he's doing in your life? Do you think God knows about your problems, your troubles, your trials, the things that you need? Do you think he can provide for the answers for all those things? Not necessarily the way we think, not necessarily in our timing. Joseph had to wait a long time to see God fulfill the promises. But God fulfills his word. God fulfills his promises. Joseph had to wait a long time. Sometimes we have to wait a long time. Sometimes we treat God as he's a genie with a magic lamp, and we just rub the lamp and tell him what we want, and he's got to produce. But that's not the way God works. God has his own timing, his own plan, and instead of giving God advice, we need to trust him and go his way. So that's what Joseph has been doing all along. Well, we move on. And the famine arrives. Verse 53, then the 7 years of plenty which were in the land of Egypt ended. Oh, that's a sad verse. And many times difficulties will come to us. Some of the good things may end in our lives. Some of the things that you had counted on may come to a close. But God has something else. And the plan is here that the famine arrives, but Joseph has provided for that possibility. So when the famine arrives, Joseph now is 37 years old. He was 17 when we started this study. He was 10 years in Potiphar's house, 2 years in prison, 7 years of plenty. Now we come to the famine. He's 37 years old. It has been 20 years since he's seen his family. Now that's significant. We're not going to get to all of that this morning, but it's been 20 years since he's seen his original family. It's been a long time. They think he's dead. If you haven't seen somebody for a long time, for 20 years, when you see them, you might not even recognize them, right? Some of you are on Facebook. I was recently looking at Facebook, and I came across the Facebook page for a girl that I had known in high school. She's an old lady. Oh, that's right, I'm an old man. Joseph is 20 years since he's seen his family. Verse 54, and the 7 years of famine began to come as Joseph had said, as God had told him. The famine was in all the lands, but in all the land of Egypt there was bread. So now the famine arrives right on schedule, better than today's weathermen, and Joseph is there. The famine arrives just as Joseph and God had said. And so now we come to the situation where the famine was, verse 56, the famine was over all the face of the earth, and Joseph opened all the storehouses and sold to the Egyptians. Joseph is the place of, that's where the answers are. Joseph is the one who has the bread. Joseph is the one who will provide for them, because Joseph followed God's plan and was the person that God wanted him to be. Joseph is the one who has the bread. Jesus said, I am the bread of life. Another parallel in the two. And so Joseph is going to be able to provide for the people. Now the famine has far-reaching effects. The famine is everywhere. The famine is universal. And so that includes Joseph's brothers back at the ranch. So Joseph is where they need to come. People everywhere are hungry, and there's only one place to get help. There's only one bread of life in our lives, and that's Jesus. Joseph was rejected by his brethren, but he was the one with the answers. He is the one who could provide for their lives, and Jesus is the only way of life to provide for our salvation. Now, when the famine comes, verse 55, the land of Egypt was famished. The people cried out to Pharaoh for bread. And then Pharaoh said to all the Egyptians, go to Joseph, whatever he says to you do. The famine was over all the face of the earth. And Joseph opened all the storehouses and sold to the Egyptians, and the famine became severe in the land of Egypt. Everyone learns where the food is, but they all have to come and get it. And when it comes to Jesus, you can find out about Jesus. You can know there is such a person as Jesus, but you have to come to him. You can know there's a God, but you have to come to him. I know a guy who told me he's an atheist, but he uses God's name more than I do. Well, not in the same way. You have to come to him. Not only knowing that there is such a person, but you have to come to him. And everyone learns where the food is, and they each have to come and get it. And the famine became severe. He sold to the Egyptians. Verse 57, so all countries came to Joseph in Egypt to buy grain because the famine was severe in all lands. Joseph is making a fortune for Pharaoh by selling the grain. Joseph is great in Egypt. He has risen to the top, and he's